So in this section, section 2, our speaker, Francesca Bray, Wesley Ling, and moderator Edith Chung will speak about women, textile, technology in Hong Kong and China. Frances is a historian of science, technology, and medicine in Imperial China, trained in Chinese studies and anthropology. However, she cannot come here to join us today because of some health issue, but she has prepared a presentation for us. Wesley is trained cultural historian and artist who uses academic writing and visual art practice to address issues in fashion. She is currently a visiting scholar at the University of Hong Kong. Edith Chung, textile catalyst of Musics Foundation. She swims between commercial and self-initiated projects, interest in all textile-related matters, ancient and modern, East and West. May I now pass the mic to Edith? Yes.
Do I need to do this, or if you? I don't need to do it. Good afternoon. The lunch is indeed very tasty, Angelica. It's really a pity that I do not get a chance to meet Francesca this time because I was all prepared. I read about her papers and books and really interested. So I thought after lunch to prepare you Chinese history, I brought along some props. For the textile specialist here, it's a little bit kindergarten, but I thought just to make sure everybody understands what Francesca would be saying, I brought some props for you. So this is rami fiber, which is a bast fiber. It's from the stem of the plant. So this is what Chinese people wore first before cotton really came into fashion, 13th century. So this is the ma. And now actually it's been revived because it's the Japanese market is shrinking and then China is trying to keep its business, so it's much promoted as habo, xiabu. Not really, not really. And I pulled my own little curtains down to show you this made in Yunnan. This is made with a rami cloth, so you're perhaps more familiar. This is probably leftover from exporting to Japan. So you get a feel this is the fabric that I'm talking about. So this is what Chinese been doing for thousands of years for the general public, while the court uses the silk. Silk I didn't bring, but I thought you would note the silkworm and the cocoon. And then next comes the cotton fiber. I didn't bring the bulb, but because in Chinese we call textiles 纺织, 纺织, and actually a lot of people mix it up because Chinese always language is a little bit blurry. So they cannot identify which part is the spinning and which part is the weaving. So this is the cotton fiber that you can, like your cotton wool used to be. But by applying the twist to it, it gives the yarn. So this is the ancestor of what the mills used to do, became machine, but this is the oldest method. And you see in every museum in early history, you have the spindle. So this is what it is. Okay. Brought along a piece of what you called in Francesca's presentation, 土布, 头布. So it's woven by villagers on quite narrow looms. So they were like this width, maybe similar to what you see in Japanese kimono, and this is cotton. So just to give you an idea, some of the vocabulary that we'll be meeting. Last of all, maybe at the end of the conference, I can pass this around, but because this is really fragile now, these are 2 cones of cotton threads that I was given a long time ago. I never knew what they were, but now I understand perhaps they are They are those cones of yarn that are lined up to pull the warp out for the weaving loom. So, and this is tied together as part of the perhaps wedding dowry, which is really nice and symbolizes a lot of things. So that's all I'm going to say now, so we can start Francesca's video.
To be here. Thank you very much for inviting me to the Mill 6 Forum, which I'm sorry not to be able to attend in person. So my subject for today is Weaving Women in China, from virtuous subject to transgressive citizen. Can I have slide 1, please? Nangang Nu Zhi, men plow, women weave, was a popular mantra for state officials and ordinary people alike in Imperial China. Men's work in the fields fed the family and the empire. Women's work at spindle or loom clothed them. Weaving skills were a mark of virtuous and productive womanhood in China throughout imperial times for at least 2,000 years. Despite some radical changes in divisions of labor in the weaving industry during the late imperial period. Handloom weaving by village women continued to provide a significant portion of China's textile needs through the Republican era. All this changed in the 1950s and 60s. Under the revolutionary policies of the new People's Republic of China, new policies towards women, towards work, and towards nation building led to the official condemnation and suppression of homespun cloth production, driving women weavers, so to speak, underground. What used to be socially valued work was now a transgression. By the late 1970s, handlooms had almost disappeared from Chinese villages. How did this dramatic reversal of the moral value of homespun and handloom weaving come about? Slide number 2, please. The classic gender division of labor for most of China's past was encapsulated in the formula men till, women weave. This demarcation of manly and womanly work was enforced through a fiscal policy that endured more or less intact between about 300 BC and the late 16th century. The Chinese state depended upon payment of taxes in kind. The taxable unit was the married couple. The husband was expected to pay the approximate equivalent of 1/10 of his cereal crop, and the wife's dues were the rough equivalent in value, paid in bolts of rough hemp cloth or plain silk, depending on the region. The state needed enormous quantities of textiles, coarse and fine. It used them for soldiers' uniforms, for clothes and payments for its bureaucrats, and textiles were often used as a medium of exchange. They also served for the clothes and regalia of the imperial court and as gifts. Furthermore, large amounts of valuable silk were used to buy horses for the army from Central Asian nomads or to bribe would-be invaders. Every family had to pay these taxes, so in medieval China, women of every class were involved in textile production. As weavers, they were active and indispensable subjects of the state, just like their husbands. While a man grew grain to feed both his family and the state, a woman clothed her family and paid the textiles as taxes that clothed the state. Unlike the social divisions between educated or noble men who worked with their minds and farmers who worked with their hands, women of all classes made cloth. Peasant women raised their own silkworms or processed the hemp that their husbands grew using simple looms small enough to fit into a cottage. Upper-class women directed a workforce of female relatives and servants rather than sitting at the loom themselves. Such households would often produce fine patterned cloth on draw looms as well as plain cloth, and the fine cloth could be used at home or sold for income. There are stories of noble women who made their families extremely rich this way. Weaving made the wife, quotes, the fitting companion of her husband. She was not his helpless dependent, but his active partner. Furthermore, the cloth that women wove played a central role in the community, in the ceremonials of marriage and of death. Wedding rituals required the exchange of cloth between families, and girls were expected to weave the cloth for their own dowries. This cloth could be used as capital instead of cash, and part would be made into quilts and pillows for the marital bed. When a death occurred, archaic mourning garb of rough hemp cloth had to be worn. The differences in mourning dress showed how closely a person was related to the deceased, and so they consolidated the kinship structures of the lineage. So weaving also produced the basic social and ritual fabric of Chinese society, a fact reflected in the metaphorical use of textile terms. The word for reeling yarn tidily onto a bobbin, zhi, was extended to mean ruling the state or healing a disease. The word for warp thread, jing, denoted the canonical texts edited by Confucius, or the regular cycles or paths of nature, including the acupuncture tracts and the woman's menstrual cycle. Women's work at the loom was not just materially essential, it was also a cosmic ordering and a moral training. In weaving, a woman performed the virtues of diligence, thrift, and the filial duty that bonded families together, just as it tied the people, min, to the ruler, jun. The complementarity of female and male labor was not just the moral foundation of society, though. If women didn't work like women and men work like men, the cosmic order was disturbed, threatening disorder in the human realm. This is one reason why official discourse strongly emphasized the importance of women devoting themselves to the loom, particularly at times when this supposed natural order of gendered work appeared to be faltering. Starting in the Song dynasty, in around 1000 or 1100 AD, the remarkable commercial growth and urbanization of the period encouraged the development of urban-based manufactures, including weaving shops, to supply quality goods to prosperous elite or merchant families. Such weaving shops usually included several looms and hired workers from outside. Respectable women, even of the lower classes, didn't work outside the home, and poorer families couldn't afford the investment in the more complex looms used in such workshops. Can we have slide 3, please? So here we see the beginning of two bifurcations in China's textile industry. In towns, women would spin at home and sell their yarn to the workshops, where men worked at the looms, producing cloth commercially. In order to pay their taxes, many urban households began to purchase cloth. Meanwhile, in the villages, most women continued both to spin and to weave, and to clothe their families and pay their taxes with the rough cloth they made on simple looms. Just as the universality of female weaving was starting to disintegrate, the state actually found a marvelous, eloquent affirmation that it could circulate to affirm the importance of gendered working traditions. Lo Shu's Geng Zhe Tu, Plowing and Weaving Illustrated. This work, pictured on the right, produced in the 1130s, rapidly acquired an iconic status in official and popular culture that was to endure until the fall of the empire. A new fiber plant, cotton, was introduced into China by the Mongol Yuan rulers in the late 13th century. Once its skills had been mastered, cotton gave a new lease of life to handloom village weaving. A couple of centuries after its introduction, cotton had become the normal clothing for peasants and city dwellers alike. Village women produced rough but durable homespun on simple handlooms. In urban workshops, men wove fine cotton damasks that were dyed and pressed till they shone like silk. In the sprawling suburban villages around Songjiang and other important cotton centers, whole families worked together to make cotton cloth, wives and daughters spinning, reeling, and dressing the looms, while the men wove at the loom. Their toil was unceasing. Writers describe looms clattering right through the night. These families had no time to grow food, but depended on the sale of their cloth to purchase all their needs. By 1600, there was a huge, complex national market in textiles and other commodities. In 1581, the state introduced the single whip policy, which discontinued tax payments in kind. Obliged to pay all their taxes in cash now, even more families turned to market production. The abandoning of traditional occupations entailed by this commercialization deeply distressed magistrates who saw it as both materially and morally risky. They were particularly upset when they found men sitting at the loom, or, worse still, women not engaged in textile work. To them, this meant that women were simply not working. But this was a symbolic rather than an economic judgment. In the eyes of good Confucians, the activity of weaving was a moral training that produced both valuable goods and estimable women. If they didn't weave, women were not deemed by the Confucian elite to be performing their proper womanly work, however hard they might be brewing or papermaking or growing vegetables to support the family. In regions where women had abandoned textile production for pragmatic economic reasons, magistrates made valiant, if typically unsuccessful, efforts to revive female weaving. Can I have slide 4, please? This ideal was echoed in popular culture. New Year prints, Nianhua, were produced well into the 1950s that depicted the 10 labors of men and the 10 tasks of women as respectively fieldwork and textile work. I move on now to modern women and their work. Given the hugely positive value assigned to women's labor in the textile sector right up to the end of the empire, in both official and popular culture, it would seem reasonable that modern reformers too would have assigned a positive value to the work of the tens of millions of peasant women in China's cotton regions who continued to weave homespun cotton, tubu, well into the 20th century. Yet, the moral as well as the economic calculus had radically changed. Chinese reformers and revolutionaries violently rejected the Confucian values, which they were convinced stood in the way of China's survival and success. They assigned high value to engineering, to the mechanization and industrialization which they counted upon to improve the productivity of Chinese labor and the rate of capital accumulation, promoting a modern spirit, national growth, and international respect. Mills, not handlooms, according to them, were the engine of China's progress. And they were indifferent to the moral, let alone the cosmic values, that had hitherto been attached to women's weaving. Indeed, since women did their spinning and weaving within the walls of the house, they viewed such activities as just one means by which the traditional Chinese woman was enslaved by patriarchy and rendered helpless, useless, and passive. In 1898, Liang Qichao complained that, quotes, out of 200 million women, every one is a consumer, not one is a producer. Because they cannot support themselves but depend on others for their support, men keep them like dogs and horses, end quote. This would have been news indeed to the roughly half of rural women who wove cloth and sold some 50% of their product on the market. It was, however, the unquestioned view shared by all Chinese modernizers. In order to liberate women from their families and from their own backward mindset, the reformers were convinced they must be given the opportunity to work, as Engels had advocated, for wages outside the home. In the 1920s and 30s, as Japanese, European, and then Chinese companies set up silk and cotton mills in China's cities through the Republic, young women from poor hinterlands flocked to the textile factories for work. But village women continued to produce large quantities of tubu, homespun, sometimes using industrial yarn, or often using industrial yarn just for the warp and homespun for the weft. Industrially manufactured cloth was often cheaper than the homespun tubu, but it didn't last as long, nor was it as warm, so homespun continued to find a ready market. Indeed, although the modernizers were convinced that home weaving must have been nearly eradicated by the competition from industrial cloth, in the late 1930s, handloom cloth still accounted for 70% of China's cotton textile output, and a quarter of Chinese rural households still spun and wove. In some Shanxi villages, quotes, a diligent weaver could feed a family of 4, even if she was the only earner in the household. So much for the useless, dependent woman. Once they were in power, from 1949, the communist leaders showed themselves to be just as dismissive of the dynamics and values of village society and of the economic and social contributions of rural women weavers as the Republicans had been. Under the revolutionary policies of the new People's Republic of China, a combination of 2 policy imperatives not only undermined but actively impeded and delegitimized homespun production, driving women weavers, so to speak, underground. Following Engels' theory that the liberation of women depended upon bringing them out of unpaid domestic labor and into the waged workforce, the Chinese Communist Party insisted that rural women spend their days working with men in the fields. Can we have number 5, please? Meanwhile, the drive towards industrializing China's textile industry as an essential base for economic development meant that cotton growers were obliged to sell all their raw cotton to the state at a very low price in return for cloth ration coupons. They were only allowed to keep 1 kilogram per year for their own domestic use, and this was supposedly not for weaving but for padding quilts and winter clothes. Unfortunately, exporting cotton proved so lucrative and so essential to the fledgling Chinese state's survival that very little of the cloth found its way into the ration fund for distribution to Chinese citizens, and its quality was poor. Desperate to keep their families clothed and warm, many village women gleaned damaged or unripe cotton bolls from the fields, or smuggled raw cotton home under their tattered jackets, quotes, returning from the cotton harvest with big bellies, as if they were pregnant. Then they labored through the night to card, spin, and weave, tubu, homespun, some of which they used for their families, some of which they exchanged for more raw cotton. Peasant families wore the warm, durable tubu in preference to industrial cloth. So they sold their ration cloth in the towns, using the cash to buy grain that was scarce at home under draconian state procurement policies. Village women's work as handloom weavers, conducted in addition to their work as farmers, saved their families from hunger, kept them decently covered, and even provided a little extra cloth for dowries and funerals. But although their handlooms continued to supply both the material and social and ritual needs of family and community, village women's work as weavers was now a transgression rather than a pillar of the social order. A sad paradox, given the Chinese Communist Party's determination to improve women's status in the new People's Republic. Still widespread into the 1970s, handloom weaving in Han ethnic villages gradually died out as the economy improved and industrial cloth improved in quality and availability. It disappeared almost completely once the economic reforms began in 1979. China is now a prosperous society. The clothing needs of the majority of its citizens are amply supplied by its booming textile industries. With wealth, plenty, and modernization has come a nostalgia for the, quotes, traditions that have been lost, a taste for heritage and crafts, a huge and growing market for authentic folk products, as evidenced by the astonishing success of the Taobao phenomenon of online sales of village products. Yet the village craft of tubu weaving has not proved fit for this craft revival. With just 1 or 2 exceptions, Han women no longer weave cotton on handlooms. Have they completely forgotten the skills? Were the looms chopped up for firewood? Or are Han women simply unwilling to resume a previously stigmatized and very demanding activity? In any case, it is striking that craft textiles in China today are produced mainly by ethnic minorities like the Dong of southwest China. By the standards of the modernizers of the 1970s and 80s, these communities were judged backward. It was therefore appropriate for them to retain their craft skills as means of livelihood. In fact, Chinese historians and archaeologists would commonly study ethnic techniques as a living survival of the ancient technologies of Han China. Today, these same craft skills are rebranded as authentic rather than backward. They have an aura of exoticism, artistry, and spirituality, which is helping them to build internet markets within China as well as abroad. Thank you very much.
I don't need to introduce you, she announced it, but just to continue from our topic, from making your own cloth. When we talk qi pao, it's really more buying the cloth and making it, right? Okay, here's Wesley.
Thank you, Edith. First of all, I want to, can everybody hear me? Because I'm a little small, so you may miss me. First of all, I want to thank Angelica and Misuki for inviting me. It's a very generous, kind gesture. And most of all, the MIL team with this excellent coordination. We had a very great time here, being very well fed and treated. Thank you so much. I do want to, oops, I have to change this, sorry. I do want to apologize for some of the images because they are quite old and some of them from historical archives, so the resolution may not be that high for a screen like this, so do bear with me. Just to begin, I'm a cultural historian interested in the cultural property of fashion and also the discourse of identity when fashion and textile is produced and consumed. With this prerequisite background, I was later trained as a fine artist in the Central St. Martin's in London, and I'm now also a practicing artist, producing work of installation, sound art, and also text work, drawing on the same theme. The qi pao which I'm going to present today is my enduring interest, with which I've written on its social cultural history, dissecting on the Chinese material culture, and also made artwork along the theme. My presentation today draws on my study on the dress and its relation to Chinese women and nationalism. It is the first time I presented my qi pao research in Hong Kong, and I'm hoping that the dress familiarity with many of you here, Hong Kong Chinese audience, would allow me to highlight the multiple Chineseness and its intricacy. The qi pao was a fashionable dress favored by women of the emerging middle class in modernizing and booming Chinese cities in the 1930s. Amid the decline of its wearing in the millennium years, the dress continued to fascinate the Chinese audience. In a recent conversation between the curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum and myself, an exhibition solely dedicated to the qi pao, accordingly, would not be sufficient enough to entice the British public. This, however, is not the case in Chinese regions. While the fascination of the dress may not seem to transcend beyond China, exhibitions featuring the varieties of the qi pao remained popular among Chinese audience across various Chinese regions. Recent years saw it proliferated in Hong Kong, Taipei, and Singapore, all of which are derived from the distinctive archives with similarly different curatorial directions. What were at stake in these qi pao shows in the said regions? Why does qi pao still matter to the Chinese? And beyond the Chinese bodily appearance, what thus the dress conveyed in these different Chinese regions? This presentation will commence with a brief history of the dress, followed by a discussion of the exhibitions in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taipei, pointing to the relation of Chinese women's bodily appearance to their identities and perceived nation. From a background of political chaos, the Chupao rose in an effort to survive and negotiate with uneven power and desire. Following its emergence in mid-1920s China, the Chupao gained immediate currency as standard wear for Chinese women until the early 1940s. Despite numerous regulations on dress and women's bodily appearance in the Republican era, the Chupao has been constantly revamped through styles and cuts. At a time when nationalism conflicted with the influx of imported goods and Western-style garments, wearing Chinese clothes like the Chupao was often seen as cultural resistance to Westernization. However, its widespread adaptation in the 1930s cannot be reduced to a result of nationalism. Rather, its adaptation reveals Chinese women's resistance to the national agenda for their bodies and appearance. Fashioning the Chupao became a silent tool for Chinese women to struggle against state regulations of their bodies. Through changes in style and responses to Western fashion trends, Chinese women tactically intervened using the Chupao to rebel against the nation's authority, challenging the dominant Western aesthetic standards. The origin of the Chupao opens up numerous debates. Popular belief lends towards its affiliation with the Manchurians whose name gave birth to the dress. Hence, it is often seen as a continual evolution of the Manchurian dress. Historical and visual evidences revealed its close association with the Chinese menswear of the time. The early 1920s Chupao had a wide, angular, and puritanical cut, resembling the men's chongpao and worn by women advocating gender equality. At the peak of women's emancipation in the early 1920s, women's cross-dressing reflected their desire for equal rights and respect for their individuality. Chinese women began to wear the chongpao, I quote, because they wanted to look like men, end quote. Dressing in men's clothes gave the impression that they could perform male's duties in society, including saving the nation, which had much to do with the nation building at the time. However, China's reformist intellectuals in the modern metropolis were engaged in a discourse on gender issues that was almost entirely dominated by men, with the majority more concerned with advancing their political power than advocating women's role in politics. In the fight for equality, Chinese women were increasingly repressed and politically marginalized. Their disillusionment turned to cross-dressing in order to obscure their womanhood. However, those who wore the 1920s angular chupao were not limited to women's activists or students who had returned from study abroad, but also trendy women who follow new ideas. Despite many suggested names to differentiate the dress from Manchu's ladies' wear of the Qing dynasty, for instance, Chongsan, Changyi, Changpao, Zhonghuapao, none were adopted. The name Chipao was eventually accepted. At the time when Chinese women were subjects of the social progress, their bodies became symbol of the nation. The angular and puritanical Chupao led the transition towards the adoption of women's national dress. As part of a new women's discourse, external manifestations of modernity, such as clothing, hairstyles, and footwear, were frequently discussed in women's magazines and forums and newspapers. Male writers dominated the press during that time, and their criticism of women's appearance in many publications resulted in more confusion than useful advice for Chinese women. Some men complained about women wearing men's clothes, while some preferred the chupao for Chinese women. The turning point for the chupao came with May 13 movement in 1925, when anti-Western demonstrations raged across the nation. Nationalism was fueled all over the country, and Chinese clothes were called to replace Western garments. Given that the chupao was already worn by some women who were seen as open-minded reformers and advocates of strengthening the nation, its adoption seems to answer the nationalist cry. Nationalism hastened the dress popularity, but not as a distinct factor in its widespread adaptation. Chinese women who refused to totally submit to Western culture saw the qipao as an alternative to the nation's intensified nationalism. Those who were attracted to Western-style garments but found the sizing and styling a poor fit choice choose the qipao as a comparable fashionable dress. The qipao accompanied Chinese women under political and social hardship, and its early adaptation filled the yawning gap between the genders. It marked an end to, I quote, hair in three tufts, clothes in two pieces, unquote, by which traditional Chinese women had been identified for dynasties. Its acceptance signaled a farewell to the past. When the qipao became women's standard wear, it began branching out into a diverse range of styles. Many new dress styles were revolved around it. Some women's magazines include instructive details such as, quote, adding 1 inch of black fur along the hems and slits, unquote, and, quote, the dress to be 3 inches below the knee with trumpet-style sleeves, unquote. Far from uniformity, the qipao varied greatly with timely styles. Such instructions gave Chinese women immediate access to dressmaking knowledge. Following the abolition of foot and breast binding, Chinese women's bodily experienced a transformation that required new wardrobe. Besides these changes, variations in style and form of Chinese women across the country were another issue. The sizing and fitting of most ready-made and Western-style garments remained a problem for many Chinese women. The qipao emerged at the right time in order to address the problem of bodily change and size variations, and the dilemma that many fashion trend followers were unable to fit into ready-made or Western-style garments. It was a custom-made dress which required fitting to an individual body. Chinese women played an active role in fashioning their qipao. At the time of political and social upheaval, while visiting the tailor remained an occasional treat for many, it was not uncommon for Chinese women to hand-sew their qipao. They made it according to the taste of the time, their needs, and their own judgment on color matching. The choices of cut, fit, materials, colors, and trimmings were often used on the wearer's personal preferences. Many illustrations of women's magazine at the time, together with the instructive details, generated imagination among Chinese women, who were both consumers and producers of their own qipao. The dress became foundation for both new styles and for Chinese women to implement stylistic changes in their clothing. Chinese women embraced stylistic changes that made it part and parcel of the fashion cycle, in tune with Western trends and influences. The dress adaptability and versatility made it ideal for style changes. Authenticity was never called into question thanks to the dress hybrid origins. It is noteworthy to such self-dressmaking tradition continues through the rising popularity of domestic sewing machine. See the wide availability of qipao making, qipao pattern making can be found in this 1960s Hong Kong advertisement. To your right, the advertisement of single sewing machines promoting self-qipao making, and note the promotion of the increased wardrobe volume with the use of sewing machine. Further to this, the qipao has an indissoluble link with capitalist drive for Western modernity and commercialization. Western powers had long imposed modernity on China via an ever-widening and interactive network of communication and exchange with the capitalist West. Western and Chinese merchants cooperate in the move towards capitalism, promoting a leisure and consumer culture in Shanghai. The movement towards modernization forced the acknowledgement of the significance of Western cultures and ideas, underscoring the hybridity of Chinese modernity. Both the qipao and its wearer were stitched into the rubric of such modernity. The 1930s qipao expressed a newness in response to the Republican search for the new women, the growing industrial complex, the consumer culture. The qipao's perceived Chinese sartorial tradition, materiality, while partnership with Western-style accessories prevailed. Its wearers in the 1920s and 30s represented an emerging middle class with some education, financial independence, and social and cultural awareness. They are the signifiers of the hegemony of the modern. Those women wearing the chupaos were significant in the creation of a progressive China and were co-opted by state as republican icons. Wearing the chupao became a desirable choice when discarding Western imports was a target for the nationalists. The influx of Western fashion soon saw the incorporation of Western-style clothing features into the dress. The use of Western elements such as fabrics and accessories in the making of chupao became a prevailing trend in 1930s China. Chinese women embraced the newfound democracy in the chupao, making it a tool for a fashionable look. Tailors merely followed the masses, leading the trend. The chupao provided Chinese women with an autonomous territory from which to silently rebel against the nation's betrayal of their body. Hence, Western puff sleeves, split slit higher to the thigh, the collar modified or removed, matching scarves, long fur coats, and high heels. The chupao held hands with Western fashion. Those keeping up with fashion trends, like movie stars, students, or prostitutes, determined new styles for the dress, which were quickly circulated among and adopted by the masses. It is debatable how far the dress departed from traditional sartorial tradition. The whole point was to be desirable in the new style chupao. The practice through which Chinese women incorporated Western-inspired clothing features into their chupao was paralleled by the nation's desire for modernization. Its banning under the communist rule for its association with bourgeois decadence only enforced its functioning symbolism and undeniable relation to national agenda. Shortly after the Cultural Revolution, there was a chupao fever for a very short period of time in mainland China. Then it surrendered to the power of international fashion. Although today the dress remained a cultural souvenir from the mainland, many consider its remade from the 1980s in the absence of skilled and traditional chupao tailors. Elsewhere in Hong Kong, the dress experienced a remarkable evolution given the mass migration of skilled tailors in the 1940s. Numerous occasions endure its lifespan: a school uniform, a marker of Chineseness, costume party wear, in many wedding banquets, as well as servicing and entertainment industry. The image of Susie Wong in her chupao in the 1950s generated Hong Kong a visible impression of East meets West, which has since categorized its chupao. Wherever it was, especially characterizes chupao in Hong Kong wherever it is exhibited. The East-West binary, owns also to its colonial past, has been a strong feature running across numerous chupao exhibitions curated by the Hong Kong Museum of History, such as all this. The image of the ever-westernized and trend-sensitive chupao in 1960 Hong Kong has been a typical ingredient for the dress contemporary creation. In Taiwan, the East-West boundary of style is complicated by colonial Japanese influence, as seen in chupao, memory, modernity, and fashion in the National Taiwan Museum. During the period of Japanese colonization, a gradual process of assimilation was enforced to inculcate Taiwan with a sense of Japaneseness. 1920s and 1930s saw the blend of Japanese and Western styles and the fusion of tradition and modernity. Anxious of the erosion of traditional values by the colonial power, in the late 1920s, the new cultural movement was launched by Taiwanese intellectuals to preserve the advantages of Chinese traditional culture. Chupao were worn on formal public occasions to assert cultural identity. Some wore it as an opposition to colonization. However, the trend 1930s fashionable chupao from Shanghai only came to Taiwan via Japan. Same to Western imports such as Hollywood movies, Western music, and magazines. It is noteworthy that the Occidental clothes, lifestyle, and consumable products first introduced to Taiwan during the colonial period were a version already featured by the Japanese. They became the instructor on the ways Occidental clothes or lifestyle could be adopted and presented. In a sense, the double gaze, in this case, East, i.e. colonial Japanese power, and West, Western influence via the lens of Japan, is at play. When it comes to Taiwanese Qipao, its aesthetic and colonial and Occidental influences have much to do with its colonial past. In some cases, the visibility of colonial touch is simply just prevalent in the making of the dress, given the use of Japanese motifs and textile. Unlike Qipao exhibitions in Hong Kong, where the focus lies in the wealth of exclusivity and sublime tailoring, the one in Taiwan drew on memories, self-dressmaking, and most of all, modernity underlined by double-score hybridity. On the other hand, Chinese pronunciation suggests that the term cheongsam refers to men's long robed in 1910s and 1920s, according to Mei Chongchong, the curator in the Mood for Cheongsam at the National Museum of Singapore in 2012. It is commonly understood that the cheongsam and qipao refer to the same dress, the former being spoken Cantonese, the latter Mandarin. While many Cantonese speakers continue to refer to the dress as cheongsam, the name implies a certain hybridity, gender exchange in this case, which partly explains its choice in the title of the exhibition. As heart of the show is hybridity, however, neither is it gender-related, nor can it be summed up or muddled up with that of Hong Kong or Taiwan. In particular, the Chineseness with which the dress is associated via Hong Kong and Taiwan is seemingly conflicted with Singapore's multicultural harmony and promotion of Asian rather than Chinese values. The functioning symbolism of the qipao is seen at work when the exhibition focuses on the social history of Singapore and the woman's role in society. A handful of dresses on display featured the incorporation of batik in its making. The diversity of wearers can be traced beyond Chinese women. The harmony of a multicultural society was mapped in a single exhibition in which the qipao has been taken to address nationalist desire, giving Chinese as the highest populated racial group in the country. The multicultural harmony that forms part of the national agenda is dressed out in the dress harmony of hybridity. The selected range of hybrid qipao in the Singaporean context allows such a preconception to persist. In spite of the influx of international fashion, contemporary Singaporean designers keep referring to their multicultural roots. As such, multi-ethnic characteristic typified the newly created qipao have its visible presence in the contemporary session. In sum, adaptability, versatility, and inclusiveness were the backbone of the qipao, whose popularity was facilitated by nationalism and the growing consumer culture following the collapse of the imperial power. Despite various attempts to nationalize women's bodies and the qipao, Chinese women defeated the authorities by tactically intervening through adapting prevailing trends in the design of the qipao. The dress became an autonomous territory from which to discard the label of women as weak and bearers of the tradition. Style change and the inclusion of Western-inspired elements have characterized the dress since the 1930s. Chinese women fashioned the qipao according to their social, cultural, economical, and political situations. Their sensitivity to the immediate surroundings saw further variations of the dress across different Chinese regions. If hybridity is this adjective of the dress, there are numerous hybridities within, all of which embody Chinese sensation in distinctive ways. Although to most foreign eyes, such sensation may deem similar, the subtle differences are huge to the Chinese. So much as the qipao remains a strong marker of cultural identity, the multiple Chineseness is a story that the Chinese choose to retell over and over again. Thank you.
We still have a little bit of time to spend here, right? Maybe if questions first. Any questions? I understand people might not be staying throughout the symposium. If there are any questions. Paula.
Hi, and thank you for the exhibition. I have one question that I'd like you to talk a little bit about, and it's in your presentation. When women started wearing cheongsam, it looked like more of a, as you said before, they wanted to look like men. So it was like this sort of like wardrobe that probably allowed them to like go out and do more physical stuff. Whereas the more, let's say, contemporary or like after the 60s, qipao is this sort of like dress that doesn't allow you to move, that makes you be like this sort of like perfect figure that doesn't move, or that it's kind of like this nimble sort of like perfect female. Can you talk a little bit about how the dress got from there to there?
Okay, thank you for the question. That was historical evidence suggests that the dress itself was formerly kind of more angular and puritanical in cut. And over time, the dress also transformed itself to be a more kind of sexy dress as we understood as today. But this is a shorter versions of these papers, so certainly is not the long history of the evolution of the qipao. But what I didn't really mention is also the 1930s, where Chinese women, there's this sort of a body movement in 1930s, where Chinese women begin to sort of relax their breast binding practice. So it was also the first time where women's breasts somehow emerged out of their own dress. And there was also the encouragement of a government where Chinese women should be strong, and also to get rid of the sort of weak and bearers of tradition as in the past dynasty. So they were encouraged to do outdoor sports and be very active, and also trained up their own body, and not to be afraid to show their body a healthy kind of style. So they have to kind of go out and be very robust, and they also show their legs by wearing shorts. So that was also the time when the evolution of the qipao dress also came to place, where the form and the style come to reveal that bodily changed. And certainly there also, the dress also proliferated in Shanghai in the 1930s. And Shanghai at the time was very prone to Western fashion. In 3 to 5 months of time, Western fashion trends actually went to Shanghai. So it's very difficult for consumers, if we can bring our own contemporary mind to it, it's kind of resisting the Western garments and Western goods. There were historical evidence to also pair with that Western H-line dress in the 1930s to the development of qipao, which you can see the synchronizing kind of dress length and also the silhouette as well. And because qipao is so versatile and is sort of like a kind of self-dressmaking garment, and very much down to the wearer itself to tune in to whatsoever influence that she wanted. So I think that somehow facilitated the development of qipao, incorporating some very kind of Western-style elements into the dress.
I would also like to add to that. I remember quite a long time ago, maybe 20 years, then V&A had an Art Deco exhibition. And I remember they were looking for qipao with Art Deco feel. And it's actually quite nice that while China was looking to the West, starting in the 1920s, the West is looking to the Orient for inspiration. So, and somehow it matches, because that qipao at the beginning was very much like a flapper dress, like shapeless. And then I think then it joined hands, because Western fabrics were coming in, lace were coming in, all these very interesting European fabrics. So there was really very creative, using Chinese traditional sort of craft, but using new fabrics. Yeah. Any other? Hello?
I found that fascinating, Wesley. Thank you very much. I know that you have a longer paper on this, but I'm kind of wondering whether you looked into, I guess there's a whole, at that time, there was a whole unbounding of feet. And of course, with the Boxer Revolution and so forth, there was this whole issue of the Chinese-ness, right, with the Western concessions being there. So was that a subtle rebellion as well, you know, in terms of having some kind of Chinese identity? throughout the time when Western powers were taking over during a very corrupt kind of last reign of the Qing dynasty?
Thank you for the question. That's a very good point. And precisely about that, foot binding and also breast binding, that's the kind of age-old tradition, which is not necessarily, well, many scholars also argue that it's not necessarily an enforcement to women, because women also opt for those options so as to marry a good family. So when the government abolished the foot binding in 1911, and I think the breast binding is sometime in later on in the 1910s, but I don't remember the exact year, there was a resistance from the Chinese women themselves to kind of abolish the whole thing, because they were afraid. So if they no longer practice this foot binding and breast binding, so how are they going to marry to good family? So that's a kind of whole anxiety of it. And I think these coincide with the sort of westernization and the nation's desire of for modernization. So in a way that there's a forceful sort of abolishment from the government that pushed this movement forward. And at the same time, you have this attraction of Western capitalism comes in with all this sort of Western garments and goods, leather shoes comes into place, and also Western garments that were available for women as well. So there was a temptation where Chinese women should actually think about a new era and kind of discarding their age-old practice to move on to something which is more modern. This said, that is not to say that there aren't criticism within society, because there are, precisely in those times, in the Republican era, when Chinese women's bodily appearance and also their kind of outfit were really subject to the nation's criticism, there are many magazines sort of forums and also newspaper primarily written by men were criticizing the women's look and body body appearance and what they should wear and what not. So they are under a very tremendous pressure of what should they wear at that time. And I think that's also, I couldn't really answer totally that question, because actually I was not from that time, but really just reading by all this sort of fascinating materials that I realized that it's a very chaotic moment. But it's also a moment where Chinese women begin to ask themselves what should they wear. And one of the things that it pushed the popularity of Chipa was because if Chinese women had to toe Western garments, that they were totally criticized, because they would just be giving up their own cultural identity and Chineseness. So the sort of the versatility of the Qibao enables them to still be Chinese, but then incorporate some new styles, something like the puff sleeves that you saw on the pictures, darts, and the kind of waist. What do you call the waist darts? And the bust darts is also the darts is also an invention of Western garments. So traditional Qibao was really just two pieces of cloth put it together, and that suits very well the traditional Chinese woman's body. And as I explained earlier on, then with the body movement in 1930s, with the abolition of breast binding, so women's body also changed, and also the encouragement of sports and everything. So those kind of Western elements somehow helped to shape the dress to a different light, and help Chinese women to also solve that dilemma of what should they wear and still be able to kind of confine to their own Chineseness.
Well, actually, by the time the Qibao arrived in Hong Kong, like 40s and 50s, in Western fashion, you have all your corsets and all your different shaped bras. So I understand, like, first of all, having a Qibao tailor is a very intimate relationship, because you're allowed to be in the same room, and he's, you're working out the garment together. And I was told that then these tailors are also advisors of what undergarments you need to have. You know, you saw some of the images from Hong Kong, like even the Susie one, she definitely have a corset underneath. So when William Zheng was working on the costumes for In the Mood of Love, the first thing he needs to work out is what shapes he needs Maggie Zheng to be put into, what sort of corset, and they research on the bras and all that, to give it authenticity. Anything else?
Ingrid. It's very fascinating. Thanks for tracing the lineage, the difference between the Qipao and Cheongsam. And I was thinking of a third term, which is chinoiserie. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that, but then also just because you made such a great presentation on timeline, like for myself, maybe some other people, when that phrase or when that came to light, because we still see that today in the reverse in terms of Western fashion, sort of consistently going back, and it's sort of always seems to go back to that particular silhouette, whether it's John Galliano's pivotal collection when he was re-entering his tenure after his absence, but then it was so on down the line. So I'm just sort of curious if you had any thoughts on that particular term.
For chinoiserie, I once had a conversation with a scholar. She was at that time studying chinoiserie, but from a Chinese perspective. And she told me that, in fact, the term is not really widely circulated in China. Nobody actually knows what chinoiserie. So chinoiserie, as if it is only just invented in Europe. And there was all these sort of huge fascinations of exactly the chinoiserie, and it comes with the impulse of Chinese potteries and goods. And that subsequently sort of aroused the whole fascinations of Chinese stuff in Europe. And in the 19th century or 18th to 19th century, that sort of fascination of Chinese has always sort of mixed with Japanese. So in many European paintings or some sort of early photographs, one can depict that the Western ladies wore a sort of a kind of hybrid kimono and Chinese robe. But it's not really a kimono, but you can't really say it's a Chinese emperor robe. But it's like a mixture of those. And they would call it something like kimono, or sometimes they would call it like a Chinese robe. But they're not anything as such at all in a traditional way. So that is something still persisting nowadays when you talk about the contemporary times, where John Galliano was a kind of one of the very prominent fashion designer who took on the Qipao as an inspiration in his collection in 1997, and subsequently raped the whole ideas of Qipao being an elegant and modest Chinese dress. And that aroused quite a lot of controversy, even in Hong Kong. I remember those times. And I think the Western fascination of Chinese clothes never really end. Well, in many ways, they adopt a very kind of very sort of on-the-surface look of what could be meant by Chinese. So they take in the very obvious features and characteristics and make it into something with their imagination, which is very different from how Chinese would interpret their own dress or how they were made into their own kind of Qipao. I think the kind of good comparison would be picking up or maybe the traditional Qipao made by a traditional Qipao tailor, and those that are designed by Western sort of designers. I mean, Galliano or Yves Saint Laurent in the 80s also has kind of those very significant style, which is taking on the Qipao in a completely different level. It was not. It didn't really follow any sort of traditional techniques of the Qipao that was straightly required. It was more like a fashionable dress than what we can consider as Qipao.
Adding my 15 seconds to end this session, I would say designers in China now do play with this chinoiserie, because I think they're looking for their identities. There are different schools, but they put a porcelain into an evening dress, which I think it looks chinoiserie, but for Chinese it's another expression of their Chineseness. So time's up. Thank you.
I do want to add on to that.
Okay.
That's a very good point, and especially, I completely forgot about it. The Met has this show, China Through a Looking Glass. It was just about 2 years ago, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's a wonderful movie.
Yeah, and indeed they were precisely playing on the very sort of very obvious types of Chinese characteristic and features in the whole show. But just what's so interesting is that it was directed by Wong Kar-wai. So there are, I mean, identity is always about external perception and internalizations. So you give and take, and you actually act according to what others would probably want you to act on. So I think that is always a sort of exchange playing around.
Thank you.